go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our fourth session of the Recapturing Liberalism in Education webinar series. I'm Susanna McIntyre. I am the Development and Clarity Coordinator for Advocacy at the AHA Foundation. And for those joining us for the first time, this is part of a six-part series that is a public education effort launched by AHA that aims to explore ideological capture, especially anti-Semitism and activist-driven agendas that have reshaped K through 12 education and what can be done to restore academic rigor, viewpoint diversity, and the foundational liberal principles our schools were intended to uphold. Um, each episode of this series builds upon the last. So we've looked at how education schools have turned away from liberalism, how activist curricula is shaping young minds, and how uh, public institutions are now actively incentivized to abandon educational neutrality. And today we will turn our focus to a particularly entrenched and powerful force in education, teachers' unions in colleges of education, and their increasingly hostile relationship with Jewish educators and academic neutrality in general. And to that end, we are honored to be joined by two highly respected voices on this topic. We have Mr. Glenn Taubman, a senior attorney at the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation, where he has spent over 40 years litigating landmark cases in labor and constitutional law on behalf of individual employees. He holds a JD from Emory and an advanced law degree from Georgetown and has testified before Congress as recently as this morning on anti-Semitism in unions. We are also joined by Dr. Brandy Shufutinsky, who is the Director of Education and Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and a nationally recognized advocate and academic. Her work focuses on the intersection of race, anti-Semitism, and education, particularly how anti-Semitism is being normalized through the training and certification of teachers. And moderating today's discussion is my colleague Michelle Hanash, the Director of Policy and Women's Programs at AHA Foundation. Michelle is also an attorney and a human rights advocate who has helped spearhead all of our legislative efforts across the nation and our programmatic efforts, and particularly on issues of child marriage, female genital mutilation, and now anti-Semitism. So with that, I'll hand it over to Michelle to guide us through today's conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susanna. So many of us have seen a very disturbing trend in K through 12 education, which is anti-Semitic and biased anti-Israel materials being introduced into the classroom. Teachers increasingly focusing attention not on the lesson plan that they're supposed to be teaching, but instead on an unrelated conflict in the Middle East. At the same time, we've also seen in the news members of the country's largest teachers union, the NEA, voting to break with a nonprofit civil rights group, the Anti-Defamation League, and with Holocaust education. The Massachusetts Teachers Association disseminating their now infamous curriculum resources that included a Star of David made of dollar bills and images and phrases seemingly glorifying terrorist violence. A joint New York Department of Education and New York Teachers Union newsletter that has been described as containing anti-Israel and anti-Jewish propaganda. We've also seen the United Teachers of Los Angeles Union currently under suit for an alleged long-standing pattern of anti-Semitic actions and unconstitutional. We've also seen the California Teachers Association actually opposing state legislation to prevent anti-Semitism in education and multiple forced referendums on the Israel-Gaza war. And these are just a few of many examples. And if not causal, the shift away from academics towards ideology seems at least to be inopportune, with the 2024 Nations Report Card showing just 31% of fourth graders and 30% of eighth graders proficient in reading, and only 39% of fourth graders and 28% of eighth graders proficient in math. And just today, new figures were released showing that only 31% of eighth graders are proficient in science, 35% of 12th graders are proficient in reading, and a lacking 22% of 12th graders proficient in math. and these represent some historic lows. In trying to understand this shift away from academics and towards anti-Semitic indoctrination in the classroom, a piece of the puzzle seems to be what is happening in our teachers' unions and teachers' colleges. And this discussion couldn't be more timely, as you heard. Brandy, you're actually testifying tomorrow on the spread of anti-Semitism in K through 12 education before the U.S. House Committee on Education and Workforce. And Glenn, you literally just came from testifying this morning before the same committee on unmasking anti-Semitism in our unions. So thank you both, not just for your time here today, but also the important work that you're doing to confront anti-Semitism. So to get us started, first it might be helpful for us to understand what the purpose of a union is. So Glenn, can you explain this?
So thank you. First of all, thanks to the AHA Foundation. It's really my honor to be here. I mean it sincerely. Unions were a concept, right? It became more and more prevalent in the post-war era. The National Labor Relations Act was enacted in the 1930s, and the idea was, we need to give workers a voice. We need to let workers bargain collectively because that'll strengthen their hand. And so the National Labor Relations Act was one of the first of the big labor laws in this country. And the idea was to protect workers through giving them this collective voice. Okay. And many states then followed suit, and there became state labor laws that would allow public sector people to unionize. Because you have to remember, under the National Labor Relations Act, it's only private sector workers that had these rights. But then later, states began to pass collective bargaining laws. And in theory, ostensibly, this was all about protecting workers' rights. But I'm going to fast forward very quickly. I was asked this question at the hearing today, and my answer was, I've been doing labor law for over 40 years. And when I started, I viewed unions as a collective bargaining agent that did politics on the side. But what has evolved over the last 40 years is that now most of these unions, and especially the unions that have their roots in the public sector, like teacher unions, they're no longer they're no longer an entity that does collective bargaining and a little bit of politics on the side. They have become massive political actors that do a little bit of collective bargaining on the side. I mean, to the unions of today, it's all about power and money. They want to be able to say, we elect our own bosses, meaning we elect the school boards, we elect the city councils, we elect people like Zoran Mandani. And so even though it started as this sort of semi-noble concept, and we could argue about how noble, but it started as a concept that we need to protect workers, and it has morphed into all about union political power, and the collective bargaining aspect is way, way diminished, if it even matters at all. So that's my answer to your question.
Well, it sounds like the purpose of unions is to protect workers' rights. Would that be a kind of general, but the original purpose?
Well, ostensibly, I'm sure many would say that even today, that is their purpose, right? To protect workers' rights. But that gets us off right away into this idea of, well, what does that mean, protecting workers' rights? If I'm a union agent and I want to run around the school promoting Hamas and promoting terror against Jewish teachers and against Israel, and advocating for the killing of 10 million Israeli Jews, is that protected union activity or not? And unfortunately, many of them would say, yes, that is protected labor activity. But I ask you, how does that relate to wages, hours, and working conditions, which is what unions were ostensibly created to do, protect employees in their wages, hours, and working conditions. But I don't believe that advocating for Hamas 6,000 miles away is advocating for anyone's wages, hours, and working conditions.
Well, it might be helpful then to explain to us kind of these parameters that govern what unions are allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. So, can you kind of just very briefly explain to us a little bit of those rules that govern unions and their
Okay.
activity?
Well, under the National Labor Relations Act, and I think this is true for most of the state laws too, there's a concept of protected concerted activity. Unions advocate, in theory, they advocate for their people who they represent, and they're protected when they're advocating for things that fall under the rubric of protected concerted activity, meaning things that relate to improving the wages, hours, and working conditions of the people who they represent. The problem is, as I said, this has morphed to where the union will say anything they do constitutes protected concerted activity, even if it bears no relationship to the people they allegedly represent and the workplace that they work in. And the examples galore are, as we heard today in the congressional testimony, literally supporting Hamas. When a university tries to discipline pro-Hamas rioters, the union files an unfair labor practice against the university and says, you're violating our right to free speech and protected concerted activity because you're trying to discipline pro-Hamas rioters. Okay, so uh, I think that's the essence of the problem as I see it, that unions are empowered by federal law and by state law to essentially run amok in these workplaces and get away from contract enforcement and negotiating for fair wages, but they want to go off on these political escapades and then turn around and say, well, this is protected concerted activity under the labor law. You can't tell us that we can't defend pro-Hamas rioters. Those are our people.
Well, what does the law say about unions and discrimination? So, potentially discriminating against their own members by, for example, I don't know, disseminating discriminatory optional lesson plans and materials to teachers, or the environment that they're creating for their Jewish teachers or their non-anti-Israel teachers by forcing referendums on issues that don't have to do with workplace conditions. And again, that hostile environment that they might be fostering.
So I would say, sadly, the legal protections for these workers are not nearly enough. Yes, workers can theoretically file with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and say that a hostile workplace is being created, a hostile work environment is being created, but there's not a lot of protections there. And especially if the school board is captured by the union, which many school boards are captured by the union. I think this is probably more Brandy's subject than mine. So we ought to give her a chance to jump in on some of this. I don't want to monopolize it, but that's something I see in Fairfax County, Virginia, where I live. Not to get partisan political right away, but the school board is 9-1 Republican, Democrat to Republican, and they are basically in bed with the unions. And this plays out all over the country. And so, yes, a teacher could say, you are creating a hostile work environment for me by doing these actions, but it's very hard for them to litigate and win such cases. The law doesn't give enough protection to the individual, but it gives too much protection to the unions and their claims of protected concerted activity.
So that's enough, you think, to overcome, from what you're saying, it seems like there's a difference between perhaps not penalizing a member of your union for protesting, but a little bit different to go ahead and actually disseminate materials that are Jewish stars and dollar bills and, glorifying terrorist violence. So how do how do you reconcile that difference with the non-discrimination standard that unions allegedly have?
Well, I think the problem in the scenario you give is really with the school board because, the unions can create this curricula, but as a parent, I thought the school board was in charge of the curricula, not the union. And the problem is that the school boards won't crack down on this and say, if you teach this vile anti-Semitic curriculum, we're going to discipline you or fire you. They won't do that because the unions will say, hey, wait a minute, that's our protected concerted activity. We're allowed to do that. So I think the pressure point is the school boards have to do more. And, ultimately the school board is in charge of not creating harassing work environments for its Jewish teachers. And I see Brandy's nodding, and I really would love to have her jump in on this.
No, I mean, I think that you hit the nail on the head there. The problem isn't necessarily that we don't have the right types of policies in place, it's that they're not being enforced by the people responsible for enforcing them. So Glenn, you're exactly right. School boards, district level administrators, sometimes school level administrators make curricular decisions. And when the unions are building anti-Israel, pro-terror curricula and putting and presenting that to the school district or to the school administrator, it's up to the school administrator to say, no, this violates our policy. This will not be used in our school district. And that's what we're not seeing happen quite often enough because these district level or school level administrators are pretty much in lockstep ideologically with the union leaders that are creating the discriminatory material to begin with.
That's a really interesting segue to Brandy. Maybe you could explain to us a little bit more about this relationship that you're seeing between teachers unions, school boards, teaching colleges. How are they influencing each other?
I think there's a little bit of a overlap and mix there. So you have union leaderships, teachers unions in particular, who don't only impact and influence K through 12 curricular materials, but they impact the type of things that are taught in teachers' colleges, which produce the teachers that then bring in bigoted or discriminatory materials directly into the K through 12 classroom. So there's a bit of a cycle there. And we're not seeing enough will from people responsible to maintain a standard of non-discrimination in the K through 12 classroom. Instead, what we're seeing is people who think that they are in the moral right or they're justified to encourage or fuel this type of activist behavior in the classroom. And that's replacing what should be happening in classrooms, which is learning and scholarship. And Michelle, you mentioned, in the beginning, you mentioned we're seeing the end result of that, where we're having K through 12 kids finishing 8th grade, graduating high school, finishing 12th grade, where a significant majority of them aren't meeting basic proficiency in things like reading, mathematics, civics, science.
Yeah, that's really alarming. And I think people have been maybe sounding these alarm bells for a long time, and it's gone really ignored for the most part for those who can actually do something to make change. And maybe now that we're seeing just such dire numbers, I mean, maybe it's naive or just hopeful that someone will kind of connect these issues together and try and do something to kind of correct course if it's not already too late. But Brandy, you have investigated anti-Semitism in teachers' colleges. And I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your work and also just your experience as it relates to teacher education, and maybe kind of give us a backstep on what teachers' colleges actually are.
Sure. So when you look at any university and you look at the list of what majors do they have, many of them have education majors. So kids that are graduating high school and wanting to go into higher education because they want to become classroom teachers, a lot of them major in education. Well, some of the research that I've done before is looking at some of these education departments at the university level to see what types of materials they're teaching future teachers, curriculum developers, and future school administrators. And one thing that I found, again, something that Glenn touched on, related to the school board in Fairfax County and a lot of other counties across the country, is there's ideological homogeneity in the curricular materials and ideology that's presented in education departments in the universities. So we'll see required classes that are really focused on ideology and not pedagogy. So we'll see classes that are really focused on things like social justice, wherever you sit, whether you think that should be taught or not. It takes up space from what's actually what a new teacher would need to learn in order to, say, identify a student with a learning challenge or identify a gifted student. So we have teachers graduating their programs unable to identify those things, or unable to actually teach a student, teach kids, teach a classroom how to read. And I believe that that's one of the reasons why we're seeing such abysmal results in things like literacy and numeracy. We have teachers who were never taught how to teach kids how to read, how to do mathematics. They weren't taught how to identify the advantage kids or kids with advantages. So, and then we have policy made in that same lane. And I can give an example. We have a couple of school districts that we've seen in recent years since COVID that are trying to detrack classrooms or detrack their programs. And what that means is they're eliminating honors and AP, any advanced classes, and they're putting all of the kids, those who have challenges and those who are advanced, in one class in the name of equity. And what that does is it actually disadvantages both the gifted kids and the kids that have learning challenges, because you can't teach a student who is, in third grade and reading at a 10th grade reading level the same lessons and same curricula as you're teaching a kid who's in third grade who hasn't yet been able to identify the alphabet. But that's what we're seeing happen in school districts across the country. And this is what's being taught to future teachers and to school administrators to detrack. And this is a theme, unfortunately, we're seeing spread. I think that especially post-COVID, when parents really got an eagle's eye view in what their kids were learning in the classroom, more parents and community members are becoming aware of what's happening and really pushing back and taking a step to push back. And we're also seeing some lawmakers and elected officials do the same. I think we need more.
Wow. So it sounds like almost what we see on the school level happening with kids is really happening on the teachers' colleges level. So they're the same problems that we're seeing affecting their ability to teach kids is happening for them when they're receiving their education. And also what I'm kind of picking up on is that these ideological, issues beyond even anti-Semitism are really shaping perhaps what's happening, the curricula, instead of perhaps best outcomes for kids to achieve in school. Does that sound like a kind of I understood that correctly from what you were saying?
Yeah, and I mean, I've said often, I've had these conversations a lot with a lot of different people, especially in recent years. And one thing that we're seeing, I think, is a switch in the purpose of school. So, if you'd ask teachers maybe 20, 30 years ago, why do you want to be a teacher? What's the purpose of school? I think you'd get a different answer than if you pose that question today. And that's something we need to wrestle with. Our classrooms, is our K through 12 education system there to build activists, or is it there to build scholars? And I think we're seeing that struggle with those two different ideas on what K through 12 education is supposed to be for.
So I'd love to delve. Oh, sorry, Glenn, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to jump in with a footnote, if that's okay. Of course, because I'm a lawyer, everything, looks like illegal issue and a legal problem, but I want to highlight a recent Supreme Court case that I'm sure you're all familiar with. I know Brandy's familiar with, where parents in Montgomery County, Maryland, wanted to opt their kids out of lessons that were, I mean, maybe Brandy could describe it better than me, but it was indoctrination of little kids about trans and I mean, all kinds of stuff that doesn't belong in a classroom, and it certainly doesn't belong in a classroom for little kids. And when these parents said to the Montgomery County schools, this violates all of our beliefs and our religious beliefs and everything else, and we want to opt our kids out of these lessons, they were told no. And the teachers' unions defended this and basically said, no, we know better how to teach your kids than you do. And this case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, which thankfully ruled that parents did have the right to opt their kids out of these sorts of curricula. So I think there's a legal fight back component to all of this.
No, I agree. I think that what's going to be interesting is Washington State just rolled out a very similar curricula about either gender identity or sexuality for very young elementary school kids. And they specifically said that parents do not have the right to opt their children out. So I'm going to be curious following again, maybe a legal fight that may be coming up based on what the Supreme Court ruled for those Montgomery County, Maryland parents.
So in a related question, who or what, bodies are regulating teachers' colleges, and who is supposed to be preparing the curriculum?
What a great question. I think that when we look at any department university, there are a couple of different levels. One is obviously the university itself. Another one is whoever's accrediting the university. But when we're looking at K through 12 education, teachers, colleges, education departments at the college university level, we also have to consider there's one other layer there that's actually supposed to make sure teachers are given the tools necessary to do their jobs. And that's the teacher certification boards, which are at the state level. And a lot of what we're seeing can be the fault of some bad actors that are taking advantage of our K through 12 education system to push their agenda. But we also have to consider that we also have a lot of teachers that are going into the profession because they want to do the right thing, and they're getting shorted. They're not being given the tools necessary to carry out their profession. We've heard from teachers that this has been their passion since they were a little kid. They knew they wanted to be a classroom teacher. They go and they major in education. They get in the classroom, and year after year, they have a significant majority of their children that aren't able to achieve proficiency in reading and numeracy and mathematics, whatever. And they get disheartened, and many of them end up leaving the profession of teaching. But we also sometimes have to do a little bit more research and figuring out, well, did you ever learn the right method to teach a child how to read? Did you ever learn phonics that you need to teach? There's a step-by-step methodology that has proven success. The Science of Reading is one of the programs that thankfully a lot of school districts are starting to adopt that can help teach a child how to read. And time after time, these teachers are saying, no, I had no idea. That's not what I was taught. I never took a class in my education major in my undergrad on how to teach a kid how to read, even though my whole coursework in my undergrad program was set up and designed for me to become a second grade teacher, that I was never taught those things. So we really need to ask the state level certification boards, are they doing right by teachers? Because if they're not, then they're ultimately not doing right by students.
Can I ask a question? I'm curious, who appoints the people who run these state certification boards? Are they all political appointees? Are they elected? I mean, how does this system work?
It varies by state, but the certification, there's a state level board of education that usually has this state level superintendent or chancellor of education. Each of the 50 states has one. And the rules for who decides those teacher certification standards for the state vary. Everything is state by state because K through 12 education is local and state. by and large. There's very little federal government control over what happens in the K through 12 space. It is very local. But again, it's a professional organization. So it's similar to saying, at least two attorneys on this call. You think about what's your professional organization to be an attorney. What is it you need to do in order to practice law in the state that you're allowed to practice in? Well, it's usually your professional organization that dictates that, the APA, right? Like it's similar for any profession that's where you need a license to practice. Education and teaching is no different.
Yeah, it might be interesting to see what types of materials they have available on their websites for, continuing education, or what materials they're kind of pushing towards the teachers to help them teach their students. Because it seems like what I'm hearing is it's really lacking in some of the basic.
Or the enforcement is. I mean, the other part of it is that we also are dealing with, there are some states that are trying to eliminate those standards completely and allow pretty much anybody to come into the classroom and become a classroom teacher. And the excuse given is, well, there's a teacher shortage, so we need to get rid of these standards, or that the test necessary to get your teaching credential is systemically racist or biased. So they're eliminating some of those standards depending on municipality and on state.
And so when we talk about the actual curricula in the classroom, who is creating that, or who's allowed to? Is there, a basic kind of minimum standard that is getting introduced, and then with, I don't know, however many minutes per, class of free time, it can be any kind of group that can introduce curriculum?
It's different. Again, it varies by district, but in many states, a classroom teacher can design his or her own curriculum as long as it meets the state level or district level standards, which are usually relatively vague. And one of the reasons for that is because you want a teacher who maybe is in Hawaii to be able to teach to the local culture and think local history maybe that needs to be learned for students that live there versus a teacher who lives in Maine. Those types of things, having a little bit of flexibility, I don't think is necessarily wrong or the issue. I think that when we're looking at enforcement of standards, from what I've seen, that's been one of the bigger issues. So a state standard can be that a teacher has to teach a subject or a controversial subject from multiple perspectives. Not from both perspectives, but from multiple perspectives. And one of the reasons is the idea is that a teacher is not going to give his or her opinion on a subject. They're going to impart knowledge on it to a student and give students the room and the tools necessary to then be able to analyze that information and come up with his or her own conclusion. That's not what we're seeing happen often enough. We're seeing curriculum that is designed in, again, attorney speak, it would be like a leading question, designed to get a student to a particular conclusive answer in subjects where you want to give kids the tools necessary to think about it and do a little bit of analysis and maybe come to a wrong or a different conclusion, but be able to back that up with some data.
Some critical thinking skills.
Right.
So what we hear time and time again, that schools are supposed to be teaching students how to think, not what to think. And it seems like that's, falling quite short of that measure. So it sounds like with some of the conversation that we've had so far, that there has been a shift in both teachers unions and colleges away from their original purposes and towards activism. We talked, Glenn in the beginning talked a little bit about this kind of activist role, but why has this shift happened is what I'm trying to figure out.
I think it's happened. Well, we have to admit there's a lot of political polarization in this country. Politics has become somewhat tribal. But even taking that as a given, I think unions have really morphed, as I said, from being teacher advocates to seeing themselves as part of this sort of woke, intersectional, you know, I mean, Douglas Murray wrote a book, The War on the West, And this fits right in with what's going on. There's so many efforts to tear down Western values, to tear down Enlightenment values, to substitute it with some notion of, I might not even know what to call it, some, sort of socialist uh, equality for all, although it's equality for some, the way George Orwell wrote in Animal Farm, some animals are more equal than others, right? Equality for all, except some animals are more equal than others. And I think this mentality has really gotten into union leadership, and they see that it's about their power and their money. And oftentimes, I think many people in unions are just apathetic and go along with it. And so the most vocal of the woke intersectional people drive the train. And that's my answer to why it's gone this way. Hopefully Brandy can say more about that.
I think that in many instances, maybe not most, but in many, there were some really good intentions. But I want to go back a little bit and just really think about K through 12 education in America. In the United States, K through 12 education has hopped on almost a different trend every couple of years. We haven't really seen for a number of years, we haven't seen a kind of a sustained, this is our mission, this is our agenda, these are our goals, and these are the ways we're going to reach them. There seems to be quite a bit of bandwagon hopping. And so, as Glenn said, as things became more partisan and more tribal, we're seeing people run to their corners and like steel themselves that they're going to keep doing this because, keep doing it until it's right, even things that don't work. And ultimately, what's happening is children are suffering. Kids are the ones that are losing out and being denied an education. And when kids are taken out of the center of what K through 12 education is supposed to be about, and instead adult interests or adult agendas are replacing what's best for children, we're going to see a K through 12 education system go the way ours unfortunately seems to be going right now. And I think ultimately it comes back to the question of, well, what's the purpose? What's the purpose of a teachers union? What's the purpose of a K through 12 schools, public school system, or even private school system in a democratic republic? And, my vision of the purpose of that is to give kids the tools necessary that when they graduate high school, they can become citizens. Whether they go into college and higher education, whether they go directly into the workforce, whatever it is, they have the basic knowledge level that they can become citizens. And that's what's being denied them right now. If only slightly over a third of kids are graduating high school being proficient in reading, that's a hit at citizenship. And if you can look, we can talk about the goal or the motivations, and I'm sure there are a lot, again, that there are a lot of bad actors when across the country in all different types of universities, education departments are teaching teachers or future teachers Paulo Freire and the pedagogy of the oppressed versus the science of reading. I think we can see a clear agenda there. And one other point I want to make here. In America, we have roughly 54, 55 million students in the public school system, just public, not including private. Think of what that means when that portion of our population of roughly 330 million aren't being taught for 13 years of education. What is that going to look like when they graduate? What's it going to mean for our workforce? What's it going to mean for people that need to be able to weld bridges and build engines and come up with cures for cancer? And that's where it is concerning. Aside from all of the obviously anti-Jewish bigotry and, let's burn down America and deconstruct this and decolonize that, which are problematic, we're creating a couple of generations of people that will not be able to function in society, at least not in a productive manner.
And it sounds like not being able to be competitive on the stage when it comes to cancer research, when it comes to getting jobs in tech and, wherever the job force is, we're not setting up American students to be competitive. And you hear sometimes people complaining about, well, why can't American kids have this opportunity? Or, they have to be competitive. And it seems like we're really struggling there. We just talked about really why there's been this shift towards activism. So let's acknowledge there's been this shift towards activism. But why did this activism have to be anti-Semitic?
Well, I think the answer to that is, as Brandy said, there's sort of the issue du jour that people want to hop onto, the teachers' unions want to hop onto. And I'm sorry to say, as a Jewish American and as a Zionist, the issue du jour that has motivated so many of these people is hatred of Israel and anti-Semitism. And it's really unbelievable that it took October 7th, the greatest massacre of Jews since World War II, to have this unleashed among the mostly among the far left. And you see it not just in the United States, but you see it in Europe, all over the place. There's what has been described as the Red-Green Alliance. There's a lot of Islamic influence and a lot of money. Cornell takes $2 billion a year from the government of Qatar. I'm sure there's strings attached. Georgetown University, one of my alma maters, is heavily funded by this money. And so you see whole departments in these schools that become very anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. But I fear that one of the issues du jour is hatred of Israel, which is a bastion of enlightenment and civilization in the Middle East, has morphed into what we're seeing today. And I think we're all a little bit in shock by it. There was a very good article in the Wall Street Journal, this past weekend's Wall Street Journal, an interview with the writer, Cynthia Ozick. And I highly recommend it to people because here she is in her 90s, a distinguished writer who grew up in New York in a Jewish environment. And I think here she is at the end of her life. Can't believe how this has morphed into this kind of anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish bigotry, genocide towards Israel. And how did this happen? Maybe it was always latent, maybe it was always there, but it seems to be the issue du jour for a lot of these people.
Oh, sorry, Brandy, go ahead.
Sure. I think that when we look at, I agree with everything that Glenn said. I just want to add that when we look at ideological capture in our education system, what that ideology is the belief that anyone with real or perceived success only got that success through the exploitation of others, and therefore they are oppressors. So people who shouldn't, again, real or perceived success. So if you lean into anti-Semitic tropes, false tropes about Jewish privilege and power, well, that's going to be perceived success. And that's going to feed the anti-Jewish bigotry that thinks, well, the only reason they achieved whatever perceived success is through the exploitation of others. And we've seen this type of anti-Semitism before. I think that, again, the idea that small little Israel, full of a teeny tiny ethno-religious minority group, has been successful, feeds that trope. And then you have the idea that anyone who has real or perceived exploitation is labeled the oppressor. And in education, what's happened, unfortunately, again, not in every case, but in far too many cases, is anything an oppressor does against the oppressed is justified. I think it's one of the reasons why we saw across university campuses and just in communities post October 7th, people angrily ripping down posters of hostages, because those posters of hostages represented a group of people who were victimized, were lynched. And the people who believe the ideology that there's no way Jews could ever be victims couldn't face it, literally couldn't face it. So they ripped down the evidence of that. Now that oppression binary has been institutionalized in our education, in higher education and in K through 12. And it's just accepted like hook, line, and sinker. Once that happens, we're going to see the fueling of anti-Semitism, and we're going to see incidents of anti-Jewish bigotry skyrocket, which is what we've seen post October 7th. I know a lot of people, a lot of other American Jews were saying how surprised they were at how either the people who immediately on October 7th celebrated the massacre or shortly thereafter began to sympathize with the people who carried out the massacre. But if you believe that ideology, it makes perfect sense. And I think that's what we've seen happen. That ideology has captured our education system, and it's replaced, again, it's replaced scholarship, it's replaced learning and teaching.
And you
Can I jump
mentioned,
in? Can I jump in on that one? I agree 100%. Thank you. You said that much more eloquently than me, but I just want to give one example. And this is attached to my testimony that I gave to the House this morning. Teachers in Oakland, as part of the Oakland Education Association, created one of these really horrific oppressor-oppressed Jews or colonial oppressors, et cetera, et cetera. They created that curriculum. They distributed it around, and they literally said to teachers, you don't have to teach what the school board wants you to teach. You teach this, and if you get any discipline or any kickback over this, we will represent you. Again, showing the unions misusing the power of protected, concerted activity so that even the worst anti-Semitic activity, they will say, that's protected. We can force this on people, and the school board can't do anything about it. And so that's the kind of the union piece to everything that Brandy is talking about.
and both of you have mentioned the word decolonize in the explanations that you've given, and it seems to me that that kind of theory of decolonization or that framework is part of this oppressor oppressed paradigm, and the situation that we see in the Middle East being kind of shoved into this very binary thought about it. But for those, not everyone watching might understand when they hear people saying decolonize this or that. So Brandy, do you think you could maybe explain how that kind of fits in with the paradigm you just talked about?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting when we talk about decolonial theory and then its misapplication to the Middle East, to Israel, for a couple of reasons, but just theory in general. We'll hear decolonize the classroom. One of my friends, former colleagues, did a whole research project on the decolonize the curriculum movement in higher education. It is this idea that we don't want to teach anything that came from dead white men. So instead of that, that's going to be replaced with so-called indigenous peoples, knowledge, pedagogy, learning, etc. The problem with it is it creates this false binary because it labels anyone who's is or perceived to be white as not having culture or indigenous roots, which isn't true. I think that Greeks are European and maybe would be considered white by these folks. I think they have a pretty good culture and their food is delicious and great music. I think we can go, and they are an indigenous people to the Greek islands. But this idea is part of that, part of the pedagogy that, again, that's permeated the education space, particularly the K through 12 education space and a lot of humanities and higher ed. And the misapplication Israel is actually what's interesting. Because if somebody really believes in decolonization, then they should understand Zionism for what it is, which isn't just a Jewish indigenous rights movement, but it would acknowledge Jewish peoplehood and Jews as an ethno-religious group that came from the land of Israel. And I do this when I speak with students, with college students. We go through language because we can't talk about settler colonialism. There are places that were colonized. And one of the biggest ways to tell is what language is spoken there and where did the language come from, and what religion is practiced there and where did the religion come from. And when you look at Jews and when you look at Hebrew, there's one place that really one major place where Judaism is practiced, and one group of people that speak Hebrew. You don't see that people are not, I mean, other than Jewish people or people that just study it, you don't see Hebrew hasn't been forced upon the people of British Columbia or the Hawaiian Isles or Malaysia. I mean, we can go through it. Those are so it's interesting to see not just the misapplication of decolonial theory, but for those who are true believers, they have to twist and turn it to make it fit this narrative, because in their minds they can't accept Jewish peoplehood, and they can't accept Jews as potentially having a history of being oppressed, because if a group has been in the oppressor box, they stay there with this ideology. So you can't be oppressed and then go on to succeed. So there's no way anyone who accepts that ideology could accept Jews or Israel because of real or perceived success. And it's real success when we talk about the state of Israel, the Jewish state of Israel.
That's very interesting, Brandy. Shifting just a little, since we're coming close to the hour, maybe the last question before we turn it over to Q&A. Is this a problem with everything we've been talking about that is an enforcement issue, or do we need stronger laws and protections? Is it a combination of both?
I think it's a combination of both. We definitely need stronger enforcement. The Trump administration, again, not to get too political right away, they're trying to change the power structure of teacher unions, of the curriculum, of defunding schools that won't clean up their act, so to speak. So we need enforcement like that. And we also need better laws. I would also say we need more informed parents. We need more informed voters. The fact that these school boards get elected, we need a parent outcry about who's running the schools and who's teaching these things to our children. So I think the short answer is it's both: better enforcement, better laws, and more activism by parents who have a stake in all of this.
Looks like
I agree.
All right, then, Susanna, I will turn it over to you for some Q&A.
Yes, we have a few pre-submitted questions, so including things like how can we prevent our schools from being indoctrinated? What can we do to stop this? I would encourage you to register for our next webinar, which will be titled Reclaiming Schools on October 3rd at 3 p.m. Eastern. And the final two episodes in our series are going to be more solely focused towards what can be done and real action steps. And that will feature Nicole Neely of Defending Education and Rebecca Shigalis of the Camera Education Institute. So I'm very excited about that next one. And my colleague Natalie put a link to register in the chat. So make sure to sign up for that to answer your question. One question that was asked that I quite like, and I'm going to adjust it a little bit, is what can be done now to counter anti-Semitic indoctrination of our children who is involved in government schools? So I'd like to address that to Brandy. But then on the other hand, I'd like to hear from Glenn about what can be done to address anti-Semitism in unions as well. So first I'll toss to Brandy.
Right, so government schools, I'm assuming public schools?
Yes.
Is that okay? I think that making sure anti-Semitism in education is my position is it's a civil rights issue. So Jewish and Zionist students and teachers are not being afforded equal protection under the law. There are anti-discrimination laws and policies on the books related to education, and those laws need to be enforced. The people responsible at the school level, district level, state level should be enforcing those laws, period. We saw a little bit of that post October 7th with these encampments and Jew-free zones that were set up on campuses across the country. We've seen this before. We've seen this before with schools that refuse to integrate. This is what this movement post October 7th has taken us back to. Forced segregation. It's illegal. I think that we need to know who's responsible for making sure that those civil rights laws and policies are enforced, and hold those people to account. When we're talking specific in the classroom, if there's material that is being presented or taught by a teacher that is anti-Semitic, that is bigoted and discriminatory, similar pattern where you speak with maybe the district level administration, but I would also encourage you to reach out to one of the many groups and organizations that have been addressing this. And I think that your upcoming sessions in the series will yield a lot of good connections and results and resources for people.
Okay, you want me to take the question of union anti-Semitism and what can be done about that? So I started when we began an hour ago talking about why unions were created and ostensibly what they were here for. But there's no God-given right to collective bargaining. There's no God-given right that unions should be able to exclusively represent teachers and have a seat at the table with school boards. And there are many states in this country that do not have public sector collective bargaining. So in those states, school boards aren't answerable to unions, and they're not required to sit down at the bargaining table with unions. And I think that's a model that we all have to look at, because there's no reason why this activist interest group is elevated above parents, above everybody else, and told as a matter of law, school boards must negotiate with you. School boards must listen to you. I think that we need an entire shift in the legal structure of employment relations so that unions are not empowered by state law or federal law to hold everyone hostage. And that was a lot of my testimony this morning in the congressional committee, that as a matter of federal law, and many states follow federal law, as a matter of federal law, we shouldn't be elevating unions to have seats at the table that other people don't have.
Hmm. One other question that I had that was kind of from the chat that I think is interesting because it brought a broader question to my mind is, shouldn't we also push for the teaching of Arab/Islamic colonization, Arab slave trade, and indigenous slavery? This is an interesting question for me because during my education, I was taught American AP US history from Howard Zinn. And I did not learn about any atrocities carried out anywhere else in the world except by America. So it gave me a very specific idea. So that's an interesting question. And in a way, it kind of brings to mind a question that is often raised, which is, should Jewish people push to be included as part of the DEI framework, or should they supersede it? I think it kind of is a similar question of, should we push for more things to be covered, or should we supersede this framework?
I think that at its core right now in practice, too much of the equity framework is rotten, and I wouldn't want to be included around a rotten table. Now, should we teach about Arab conquest and colonization and the trans-Saharan slave trade? Well, I mean, it's part of history. So for teaching the truth and teaching real history, I'm for teaching all of it. I think that we should be talking and teaching students about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I don't shy away from the truth in American history or in world history, but it needs to be the truth, not my truth, not, oh, this narrative. It needs to be the truth. And history is, I mean, I know a lot of people, I was a history major, history and poli-sci in undergrad. And I know a lot of people who majored in the hard scientists turn their nose down a little bit at the soft sciences or social sciences. But I mean, we have actual scientific evidence of a lot of history, and I'm all for teaching kids the good, the bad, and the ugly of it all at the age appropriate level.
Yes, of course. So that wraps up our time today. Thank you once again to our panelists, Mr. Talbot and Dr. Shufutinsky, for your time and your insights. And thank you also to my colleague Michelle for leading today's discussion. If people are interested in following you or learning more about your work, where can they find you? I know that we put some links in the chat, but go ahead, Brandy.
Oh, no, I mean, I'm on X. I think you can follow me there. You can look at more of the work that we do at FTD, our national education and national security program. And yeah, the links are in the chat. So thank you, Susanna and Michelle. And thank you very much, Glenn. It was an honor to be speaking with you all today.
Thank you. I just love this discussion. I love the AHA Foundation. Thank you. My website is www.nrtw, as in National Right to Work.org, and that information is in the chat room. And I also love the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. So my hat is off to Brandy. And you can find us if you have questions, and I'm happy to chat with anybody.
Lovely. So, to our audience, if you found today's session helpful, we encourage you to register for our upcoming webinar, which I mentioned, which is titled Reclaiming Schools, Equipping Parents to Push Back on Radical Agendas in Education. Again, that's on Friday, October 3rd at 3 p.m. ET. And in that session, we'll be focusing on grassroots efforts and highlighting how parents are organizing across the country to take their school boards back and demand educational excellence. And later this fall, we will host our final session. We're still, nailing down that final date on how to build coalitions across ideological lines to help restore real academic rigor in our educational system. Because this is very clearly a bipartisan issue. And as always, thank you for attending. You can always learn more about our work at theahafoundation.org. And thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.